At Christmas dinner, my grandfather turned to me. "Everything good at University of Pennsylvania, UPenn?" he asked. I stared back in disbelief. "What university, Grandpa?" "I'm working 2 jobs a day saving up for college next year." My grandfather slowly shifted his gaze to my parents. "Paul, explain." In that moment, it dawned on me that my father seemed to be hiding something. "My name is Rowan Clark, 20 years old, from Pennsylvania." At first glance, my neighbors likely thought my family was perfectly happy and loving. The truth, however, was debatable because my life, from the very beginning, had been a continuous inconvenience for Paul Clark. I was the result of a fleeting affair, as he dismissively called it. My birth mother, Sarah, was a gentle, artistic soul who loved me boundlessly but struggled against harsh realities. We lived a simple life. She worked tirelessly, her hands calloused but her spirit unyielding. Our tiny, cramped apartment, humble as it was always filled with her laughter, her soft songs, and the comforting scent of wildflowers she insisted on keeping, even when money was tight. Those quiet days, I believed, would drift by peacefully. But fate only allowed me 8 short years with my mother. Then that fragile bubble of happiness quickly burst when doctors delivered the news. My mother had a rapidly progressing, unforgiving illness. I vividly remember the day she led me to Paul's doorstep in Spruce Hill, Philadelphia. The house loomed, intimidating, with its perfectly manicured lawn and a gleaming black car in the driveway. It was a world entirely different from our small apartment. My mother, frail and trembling, looked at Paul, her eyes pleading. "He's your son, Paul," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Promise me you'll take care of him." Paul, looking uncomfortable and resentful, finally nodded, a reluctant acceptance, driven only by the desperation evident in Sarah's eyes. Paul had rejected me once when Sarah told him she was pregnant with me, and now, 8 years later, she had come back to beg him again. My forced entry into the seemingly perfect Clark household was immediate and jarring. Paul introduced me to Vivian, his wife, sharp, impeccably dressed, and their 4-year-old son, Preston. Vivian's smile didn't reach her eyes. They were cold, assessing, already marking me as an unwelcome intrusion. Preston, a plump, pampered child, immediately became the center of their universe, surrounded by effusive affection and countless toys. And me? A polite, almost apologetic nod, a hand-me-down sweater, or a cheaply made, indifferently chosen trinket, a token gesture of inclusion that felt more like a dismissal. I was relegated to the attic, a small, dusty room like a temporary holding cell. My belongings, a tattered suitcase, seemed to shrink in the vast emptiness. The years that followed were a slow, painful erosion of my spirit. My childhood was a stark study in contrasts. Preston's birthdays were lavish affairs, his Christmases overflowing with the latest toys and gadgets. My academic achievements, hard-won and deeply cherished, were invariably ignored or met with a dismissive wave of the hand, a change of subject. Meanwhile, Preston's mediocrity was hailed with effusive praise, his minor accomplishments celebrated as grand victories. Vivian, a master of subtle cruelty, chipped away at my self-esteem with passive-aggressive remarks. "Are you sure you need another plate, Rowan? We shouldn't overdo it." Or when I excelled at a school project, "Oh, that's pretty good for you." Paul remained emotionally distant, a vague presence in my life, always busy with his important insurance management work, always deferring to Vivian. He was a weak, easily manipulated man, prioritizing his new family's image and comfort above all else. My existence was a constant reminder of a past he yearned to forget, a blemish on his carefully constructed perfect life. Yet through it all, there was one constant, a steady beacon in the solitary landscape of my childhood. Frederick Clark, my grandfather. Paul's father. He was a dissenting note in their perfect family portrait, the one who saw me, truly saw me. When he discovered my existence years after my birth, he was consumed by a quiet fury at Paul's initial rejection. Driven by a deep sense of responsibility and perhaps a desire to atone for Paul's moral lapse, I felt Frederick's affection for me more keenly. It showed in the toys and new clothes he bought for me when he visited Paul and his wife. My life continued this ordinary trajectory until high school graduation, a bittersweet milestone for me perhaps. My burning desire was to attend UPenn and become a software engineer, a dream I clung to with desperate hope. I spoke to Paul, my voice trembling with carefully reined-in excitement. His response was a cold, indifferent shrug, delivered with the ease of a man accustomed to dismissing inconvenient truths. "Not enough money, Rowan. Preston's future is our priority. We simply can't afford it." The words spoken with an indifferent finality crushed me. My heart ached, a deep, silent devastation, heavy to the point of being unbearable. He didn't even look at me, his gaze fixed on some distant, selfish future for Preston. The unspoken message was clear. My dreams were meaningless, merely a drain on resources meant for his real son. Crushed but unyielding, I refused to let their neglect define me. I found 2 grueling jobs, a supermarket cashier by day, a restaurant kitchen assistant by night. For a year, I endured long hours, meager pay, and the bone-deep fatigue of constant standing. Every penny earned was meticulously saved, a silent act of defiance against the family's lack of support. I moved out, finding a cheap rental apartment on the outskirts of Philadelphia, a small independent haven that, humble as it was, felt more like home than any place they had ever granted me. I meticulously documented my earnings and savings, a small ledger of my quiet rebellion. My ambition, once fueled by dreams, now burned with a colder, harder flame, a desperate urge to prove them wrong, to build my own future brick by painful brick. The chill of December seemed to paint the loneliness in my soul. But then a Christmas Eve phone call warmed me. It was Frederick. He had deliberately come to my father's house from New York City to surprise us on Christmas Eve, but since he didn't see me, he urged me to come home. The scent of roasting turkey and cranberry sauce hung in the air, a festive veneer over the strained silence that cloaked the gleaming dining table. Christmas Eve, a time for warmth and family reunion, was anything but. I had just arrived, the December chill still clinging to my coat, and now I sat across from Paul, my biological father, and Vivian, his wife, their faces set in stiff, starched smiles. Preston, my half-brother, remained oblivious, glued to his phone at the far end of the table. "Rowan, my boy!" Frederick's voice boomed, shattering the awkward silence, a warmth I rarely felt from this family. He beamed, his usually sharp, discerning eyes now crinkling at the corners. "Everything good at University of Pennsylvania, UPenn? How's your studies going?" The words hit me like a physical blow, a sudden cold wave of shock. UPenn? Studies? My mind reeled, trying to reconcile his question with the harsh reality of my life. The clinking of cutlery seemed to amplify in the sudden echoing silence. I saw Paul shift slightly, a slight twitch around his mouth, and Vivian's smile falter, her eyes darting between Frederick and me. A heavy lump of lead formed in my stomach. I opened my mouth, the truth bitter as ash on my tongue, but impossible to withhold. My voice, when it came, was a strange blend of disbelief and quiet defiance, each word a stone dropped into a still pond of deceit. "UPenn?" I repeated. "Grandpa, I'm not in college. I'm working 2 jobs a day, saving every penny just to afford to apply next year." Frederick's smile vanished as if wiped clean from his face. His eyes, once warm, now hardened to granite, slowly, deliberately turned to Paul and Vivian. The festive hum in the room died, replaced by an unsettling stillness. His voice, when it came, was cold and sharp, like a blade cutting through the silence. "Paul, Vivian, explain." In that moment, as I watched the panic flare in their eyes, a chilling realization washed over me. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This wasn't just their usual indifference. My father was hiding something from me, something terrible. This wasn't about me not having a degree. This was about a deliberate, calculated deception. The twinkling Christmas lights on the tree suddenly felt glaring, mocking, illuminating a darkness I was only just beginning to comprehend. The years of quiet neglect, the subtle, cruel remarks, the persistent feeling of being an inconvenient truth, it all coalesced into a single devastating conclusion. My life, I understood then, was a meticulously orchestrated lie, and tonight it had finally unraveled. Frederick, his face a mask of barely suppressed fury, grilled my father about my lack of university enrollment, while the trust fund documents my father had sent him showed a systematic depletion of my education fund, and worst of all, the fabricated reports they'd sent him for years, carefully crafted to portray me as well cared for. My supposed presence at UPenn a triumphant lie. "Paul, Vivian." Frederick's voice was low, vibrating with restrained rage. "You have systematically siphoned off Rowan's trust fund, nearly $200,000, for your lavish lifestyle, for Preston's private school, for luxury cars, Vivian. And Paul, your failed investments." He slammed his hand on the table, making the cutlery rattle. "You sent me fabricated reports assuring me Rowan was thriving at UPenn while he—" Frederick gestured angrily towards me, his voice choked with emotion. "Is working 2 jobs, struggling to make ends meet, believing he's a burden?" Paul stammered, a pathetic, desperate attempt at justification. Rowan wanted independence, father. He said so himself. Preston needed it more. It was for the family's greater good." His voice faded, a thin, unconvincing whine. Vivian, her face pale with panic, recovered faster, her cruelty flaring. "He's not my son, Frederick. He was never meant to be a part of this family. He doesn't deserve such a fund. It was a mistake, an old man's folly." Her words, sharp and venomous, solidified her cruelty, solidifying the depth of her contempt, her true emotions laid bare in desperation. Frederick's rage thundered, echoing through the now silent house. "Betrayal! This is betrayal of the highest order, Paul. Betrayal of my trust, betrayal of your own son's future." He turned to me, his gaze softening, but his voice remained resolute. "Rowan, my boy, you are coming home with me to New York immediately. As for you two," his gaze swept over Paul and Vivian, cold and unforgiving, "I will begin legal proceedings immediately to reclaim every last cent of that stolen trust fund. And all ties, financial or otherwise, between my family and yours are severed permanently." I stood there, the weight of the betrayal pressing down on me. This wasn't just a dream denied, an education thwarted. It was a deliberate, systematic theft of my entire future, orchestrated by the very people who claimed to be my family. The years of struggle, the persistent feeling of being a burden, the unending craving for their approval, it all now took on a bitter new meaning. The hurt, sharp and raw, transmuted into something colder, harder, an unyielding, principled determination. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was a deep, principled detachment, a quiet understanding that I was, finally, irredeemable, free from their toxic embrace. I moved almost automatically, gathering the few belongings I had brought, my worn backpack, a couple of books. I met Frederick's gaze. A silent understanding passed between us, a bond forged from shared outrage and mutual respect. I didn't look back. I uttered no accusations, no outbursts, no desperate pleas for understanding. There was nothing left to say, no emotion left to spend on them. I simply walked out, leaving Paul and Vivian in their shock and despair, their perfect, shattered world collapsing behind me. The heavy door closed, severing the last fragile connection, one that had only ever brought me pain. On the night drive to New York, amidst the quiet of the night and the passing streetlights outside the window, Frederick filled the silence with serious words. He didn't just share contract terms or the complex legal issues related to the recent incident, but also revealed more about my future. In that confidential conversation, I not only found a solid anchor, but also gradually came to understand Frederick Clark, my grandfather, not just as a successful businessman, but as the soul, the CEO of a technology empire called Ether Innovations. New York City was a symphony of chaos and opportunity. The moment Frederick and I stepped out of the taxi, the city enveloped me. A vibrant tapestry of yellow cabs, skyscrapers reaching for the clouds, and a relentless hum of energy that coursed through the streets. It was a stark contrast to the quiet deception of suburban Spruce Hill, a world away from the tiny, dusty attic room that had been my prison. Frederick's mansion, nestled on a quiet, tree-lined street in the Upper West Side, was a sanctuary of peaceful luxury. My new room, spacious and filled with light, with windows overlooking a meticulously manicured small garden, felt like a dream I'd never dared to dream. Frederick, true to his word, didn't just give me a home, he gave me a future. "You'll enroll in NYU's software engineering program," he declared, his voice firm yet kind, as we sat in his study amidst the scent of old leather books and paper. "It's one of the best. And you'll work at Ether Innovations. Start as an assistant, learn everything. You have a good mind, Rowan. You will excel." He saw in me what Paul never had: potential, not just a problem to be solved. Life in New York became a whirlwind of intellectual challenge and newfound stability. I immersed myself in my studies, the complex logic of programming, a welcome escape from the tangled emotions of the past. At Ether Innovations, I started at the bottom, learning everything from network infrastructure to cloud security. Frederick was a patient mentor, his guidance extending beyond business. He taught me about integrity, about building things that matter, about the quiet power of persistence. He also told me more about Sarah, my birth mother. He shared stories of her artistic soul, her quiet strength, and her unending dreams for me. He spoke of her gentle laughter, how she found beauty in the ordinary. Hearing about her, truly connecting with her memory through Frederick's eyes, helped me heal, to find peace with my origins and understand that I was born of love, not just a fleeting affair. It was in a challenging C++ class at New York University that I met Skylar Wilson. She was bright, witty, and possessed a no-nonsense practicality that grounded me. We bonded over late-night coding sessions and shared frustrations over complex algorithms. Skylar, herself an IT and software engineering major, became my confidant, a non-judgmental presence in my new life. I gradually opened up to her, cautiously at first, then more easily, sharing fragments of my past, the quiet neglect, the profound disappointment. She listened patiently, offering silent support and fresh perspectives that helped me navigate my new social and academic world. With Frederick's unwavering presence and Skylar's genuine friendship, I slowly shed the invisible cloak of neglect I had worn for so long. Meanwhile, Frederick, a man of his word and a formidable opponent, had initiated legal actions against Paul. The legal battles were brief, almost perfunctory. Paul, lacking Frederick's business acumen and legal resources, was no match. The stolen trust fund, along with other assets Paul and Vivian had acquired through the misuse of the fund, were frozen, and legal proceedings to reclaim the fund had begun. I heard very little about it, as Frederick shielded me from the details, wanting me to focus on my new life. Months later, a plain white envelope arrived at the mansion, addressed to me. My hand trembled slightly as I opened it. The letter was not a heartfelt apology, not exactly. It was a plea for leniency, a lengthy, desperate message filled with excuses and vague promises. He cited the crushing legal pressure from Frederick, the looming threat of bankruptcy. He even offered to transfer some assets, remnants of the misused fund, back to me. To right the wrong, he wrote, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Assets that, I knew, had originally been stripped from my stolen fund. I held the letter for a long time, the words blurring before my eyes. The bitterness of the past resurfaced, a dull ache like a sharp metallic taste on my tongue, the persistent sting of neglect, the gnawing pain of being sidelined, the oppressive weight of their casual cruelty. It all came rushing back. But this time, it was tempered by something new, something stronger. My newfound strength, forged in the fires of self-reliance, and the principles Frederick had steadily instilled in me. I recognized the allure of petty revenge, the fleeting satisfaction of watching them squirm, but I craved something higher. A path to true peace, not just momentary vindication. I took the letter to Frederick's study, the quiet sanctuary where we often discussed my studies, my future. He listened patiently as I read Paul's carefully worded plea, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he simply nodded. "The law will do its work, Rowan," he said, his voice calm. "But this is your life. You decide what peace looks like for you." His words were a quiet affirmation, a gentle nudge towards the path he knew I was considering. He had never pushed me towards vengeance, only towards self-respect and the pursuit of justice. My decision, when it came, was clear and unwavering. I chose not to pursue a full lawsuit, not to reclaim every last penny through prolonged legal battles just to prolong the bitter entanglement. Instead, I accepted the settlement Frederick had forced Paul to make. A substantial sum, though likely less than the full amount they had stolen. This money, my money, would now fully fund my college education and living expenses, making me truly self-sufficient. It was a quiet act of self-reclamation. "I want to build my future," I told Frederick, my voice firm, resolute, "not live to fix the past." This act symbolized my complete emotional detachment from their control. My refusal to let them dictate my peace, and my unwavering focus on forging my own legacy. As the months wore on, a subtle shift occurred in the whispers that occasionally reached me from Philadelphia. Frederick's network, always discreet, provided glimpses into the unraveling of Paul and Vivian's carefully constructed world. Paul, it turned out, had lost his job at the insurance company. Distraction, poor performance, and a tarnished reputation had finally caught up to him. Vivian, accustomed to a life of leisure and extravagant spending, struggled to adapt to the harsh reality of earning a living. Her once perfect social facade began to crack under financial pressure. They were forced to sell the Spruce Hill house, the very symbol of their superficial perfection. The proceeds, I learned, barely covered their mounting debts and legal fees. They moved into a small, run-down apartment on the outskirts of Philadelphia, a stark contrast to their previous comfortable existence. This shift was reported to me as a cold, factual detail, devoid of glee. It was simply the inevitable consequence of their choices, and Preston, the golden child, the recipient of all their misguided ambitions and stolen funds. Now around 18 or 19, a few years younger than me, he was the embodiment of the bitter irony in their decline. He'd briefly attended college after high school, but without the endless flow of money and constant pampering he had known, he quickly dropped out. Unaccustomed to pressure, to real responsibility, he struggled. He took low-paying jobs but couldn't keep them, constantly fired. His sheltered life had rendered him ill-equipped to cope with the harsh realities of the world. I heard he began associating with bad company, and the whispers grew darker. He was getting into drugs, a desperate escape from a reality he couldn't comprehend or control. Their downfall, I observed from a distance, was a slow, painful process, a meticulous dismantling of the very threads they had carelessly pulled from my life. Months after hearing of their decline, my phone, usually a gateway to new opportunities and my quiet connection to Skylar, rang with an unfamiliar Philadelphia number. My stomach instinctively tightened. I knew. I took a deep breath and answered. "Rowan, is that really you?" Vivian's voice, once sharp and authoritative, was now weak, reedy, utterly stripped of its former arrogance. The desperation in her tone was palpable, a chilling echo of the cruelty I remembered. "Rowan, please, you have to help us. We're ruined. Paul, he lost everything. He's gone, and Preston... Oh, Preston is so sick. Drugs, Rowan, it's bad. Please, just a little help. We have nothing left." I listened, a complex mix of emotions stirring, a fleeting flicker of satisfaction, an underlying weariness, and a cold clarity that cut through any lingering sentimentality. The pain in her voice was real, undeniable, but it was pain of their own making. I heard a manipulative, desperate mother, not a victim. My response was calm, steady, each word a stone set in place. "Vivian," I said, my voice devoid of emotion, "you and Dad never considered me family. You treated me as a burden, an unwanted shadow. Dad took my entire education fund from Grandpa, a future that was rightfully mine, so you and he could live lavishly and spoil Preston. He took that from me." I paused, letting the silence settle, forcing her to absorb the weight of my words. I had to fend for myself. I worked 2 jobs, saved every penny, lived in a tiny apartment, all to get where I am today. You didn't help me then. You actively took from me. My voice hardened, a quiet resolve echoing down the line. And now you want me to help Preston, who was always favored, who was always handed everything at my expense. No, Vivian. Let Preston learn to stand on his own just as I had to. Let him face the consequences of his choices and the choices you and Dad made for him. This is your battle now. Your family needs to sort itself out. I heard a choked gasp on the other end, but I didn't falter. I had built the walls too high, fortified them with too much pain and hard-won independence. I hope you find the strength you need, I added, an empty courtesy, before gently, definitively ending the call. The click of the phone echoed in the sudden silence of the apartment, a reaffirmation of the boundary I had drawn, an unwavering line. Weeks later, a new project at Ether Innovations required me to be in Philadelphia for a few days for a tech conference. The city now held a different feel, no longer a place of quiet struggle, but a backdrop for my newfound independence. One afternoon between conference sessions, I found myself driving near an intersection in Kensington, a harsher urban part of Philadelphia. Gritty brick buildings, graffiti-covered walls, empty lots. It was a stark, almost visceral contrast to the manicured lawns of Spruce Hill. And then I saw him. It was Preston Clark, my half-brother. He stood on a street corner, a mere shadow of his former self. His once pampered appearance was replaced by disheveled clothes, a gaunt face, and eyes that were hollow and distant. He swayed slightly, clearly under the influence of drugs, his movements aimless, pathetic. The sight struck me with unexpected force, a strong internal struggle immediately igniting within me. A flicker of past connection or basic human compassion briefly surfaced, battling against years of accumulated resentment and the cold clarity of my principles. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. A voice echoed in my head. Drive away. Just drive away. Let them face the consequences. This is their battle, not mine. But another voice, smaller, more resolute, spoke of a final, definitive act. Not forgiveness, not even compassion, but a final lesson. It was a chance to close this chapter not with bitterness but with a stark, undeniable truth. I found a parking spot a block away and approached him. Preston's eyes, clouded by addiction, slowly focused on me. A flicker of desperate hope tinged with shame lit his gaze. "Are Rowan?" he mumbled, his voice raspy, weak. "Is that really you?" He looked around as if expecting rescue or perhaps a plea for help. My voice was calm, utterly devoid of emotion, a stark contrast to the turmoil within me. "Preston." I got him out of immediate harm's way, guiding him to a temporary safe spot, a quiet bench near a small, desolate park, ensuring he was no longer on the street in that state. He leaned back against the bench, his head lolling. I don't know what to do," he whispered, his eyes welling up. "It's all gone. Dad, Mom, everything's messed up. I need help, Rowan, please." I looked at him, truly looked at him. Not the pampered child who had so easily benefited from my stolen future, but a broken young man now facing the harsh consequences of a life with no real foundation. My words were calm, measured, unyielding. "Preston, I had to stand on my own when no one helped me. When your parents prioritized you over me, when they stole my future, I found my own way. You can too. You have to." I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. "Get a job. Learn responsibility. This isn't about what you used to have, Preston. This is about what you build for yourself. Don't look to me to fix what the family broke. This is your battle, and you have to fight it." I stood up, the autumn wind rustling dry leaves around my feet. I didn't look back as I walked away, leaving Preston alone on the bench, grappling with the stark reality of his choices. This moment, I knew, symbolized my final release from the past's hold. My revenge was not their ruin, but my own strength, my refusal to be pulled back into their dysfunction. My journey was forward, not backward. In the ensuing months, life in New York continued its quiet, graceful unfolding. I excelled in my IT/software engineering studies at New York University, my mind constantly stimulated by new challenges. At Ether Innovations, I took on more responsibilities, leading small projects, my confidence growing with each success. The sense of belonging, of being truly valued, was a balm to old wounds. My relationship with Skylar deepened. She became more than a friend. She was a partner, a constant source of support and understanding. We spent weekends exploring New York City, sharing dreams, building a foundation of trust and mutual respect. A stark contrast to my fractured past relationships. With Frederick's unwavering love and Skylar's genuine friendship, I had found a true family and community in New York City. A place where I was seen and appreciated for who I was, not for what I could provide or how I fit into someone else's narrative. On quiet evenings after a day of studies and work, I found myself drawn to writing. Not a bitter retelling of the past, not a self-pitying lament, but a personal journal that gradually evolved into a story. A documentation of lessons learned about resilience, about finding self-worth, and about transcending past hurts. It was a final act of healing, a way to process the pain, to transmute it into wisdom. I wrote about my mother Sarah's quiet strength, Frederick's unwavering integrity, and the profound importance of building one's own legacy, brick by painful brick if necessary. Looking back from the vantage point of my new life, a sense of quiet peace settled over me, a profound vindication. The journey had been arduous, painful, but ultimately redemptive. My own transformation, the blossoming of my self-worth, the relentless pursuit of my dreams, that was the true victory. My principled stand, as difficult as it was necessary. For my growth, yes, but also for their accountability. I often reflected on the lessons etched into my very being. True family, I had learned, was built on respect and truth, not merely bloodline or stolen opportunity. It was in Frederick's unwavering support, in Schuyler's genuine friendship, that I had found the true meaning of belonging. Responsibility, I now understood, was not a performance for others, but the quiet, relentless persistence in the face of adversity. It was in the aching hours of 2 jobs, in the meticulous documentation of my meager savings, that I had truly learned its meaning. And sometimes I realized the ultimate act of love and self-respect was to allow others to face the consequences of their own choices, to refuse to enable their dysfunction even when it hurt. My worth, I knew now with a deep, quiet certainty, was not defined by their neglect, by the emptiness they tried to inflict upon me, but by my will to build my own legacy. It was built on the foundation of my own hard work, my integrity, and the genuine love I had found. The scars from the past would always be there, faint reminders of where I had been, but they no longer bled. They were etched, yes, but they no longer imprisoned me. They were a testament to the darkness I had faced and the light I had found shining brightly in my new life, in the heart of a city that had welcomed me, and in the embrace of a family I had chosen. I had found my peace, a quiet vindication that resonated deeper than any loud accusation or declared triumph. Hey guys, welcome to the channel. We're just getting started and your support means the world. If you enjoy these stories, please consider subscribing and help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers. Thanks so much for being here.